Well, welcome everyone. If we have not had the chance to meet, I am Rabbi Victor Appel from Temple Emanu-El in Westfield, New Jersey, apparently connected to WandaVision. And I'm very excited to welcome you all tonight to our program, which is brought to you in partnership with the Jewish Book Council. And the Jewish Book Council is a great organization that brings forward many Jewish books, books by Jewish authors, books with Jewish topics, books of Jewish interest um, to large audiences. And so we've been very fortunate to be partnering with the Jewish Book Council for the last couple of years. And this year, because of the pandemic and through Zoom, we are able to bring a huge number of authors to our congregants. And tonight, we are fortunate to have with us Scott Shay, who is the author of In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism. And I'll confess, before I read the book, I thought, oh, he's an atheist. I won't give the answer away. And as it turns out, Scott has several connections to our congregation, including a very long and strong connection with our member, David Golish. So it's my pleasure to invite David to introduce Scott before we dive into our talk tonight.
Good evening. I'm Dave Golish. I'm pleased to welcome my friend and former partner, Scott Shay, back to Temple Emanu-El. Let me share a few highlights of Scott's career. Born in Chicago, but has lived in New York City since 1980 when he came to work for Solomon Brothers. Scott and his wife, Susan, have 4 children. Scott is a world-class expert on banking, Bitcoin, blockchain, derivatives, Israel, and the Torah. In the early 90s, Scott spent his lunch hour mastering Hebrew. Scott is a leader in Jewish Federation, Hillel, Birthright, and too many others to mention. Scott tonight will be talking about his latest book, In Good Faith. Challenged in 2013 by a business acquaintance as to why waste time in worshiping some made-up God, Scott took it upon himself to spend the better part of the next 4 years defining his answer. Now Scott will tell us about his journey and the answer.
Great, thank you, David, for that introduction. And Scott, let's dive right in. For those who haven't yet had a chance to read the book, and I just put in the chat box your website, scottshay.com. I invite you all to go there and to get to know Scott a little bit better. And there's also a link to buy the book. And I encourage you to buy the book. It is a very good read. So Scott, let's begin. Tell us a little bit about the book and how you came to write it.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I want to thank David, my longtime partner. We've known each other since, I think, 1981, 82. I'm glad to say neither of us have visibly aged. We look just the same. And it's always a pleasure to be in any place with Dave. So how did I write this book? It's actually not a book I really intended to write, but I wrote a first book that some of you may know. It was called Getting Our Groove Back, How to Energize American Jewry. And this book actually, Getting Our Groove Back, actually became somewhat of a bestseller in the Jewish world. Not outside of the Jewish world, but within the Jewish world. And I had all sorts of people surprisingly coming to me and saying, the book, by the way, Getting Our Groove Back, is not about religion. It's about, I was at the time on chair of the Commission on Jewish Identity and Renewal for UJ Federation. I was involved in distributing, I was chairman of a group that distributed something like $16-17 million a year to Jewish education, informal and formal, Birthright, all sorts of things. So that's why I wrote the book. But I found people coming to me and saying, Scott, you seem like a reasonable sort of guy. Why are you so interested in preserving the Jews? I mean, that's all, nice, but besides being fond of lox and bagels and Chinese food on Christmas Eve, we all know that this is bunk. And so what's the point? And I was struck by the fact that so many people were saying, frankly, a lot of Jews were saying this to me. I also had folks who knew I wrote this book who weren't Jewish say things like to me, to one friend who, of course, will go unnamed, sent their children K through 12 to Catholic school and then to Georgetown, which is a Jesuit school. And this child was literally in the choir, totally committed Catholic. And after a class on comparative religion at Georgetown, where he was given to read Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion and Christopher Hitchens' Why God is Not Great, How God Poisons Everything, he became an atheist. And as time went on, I'd hear more and more of these stories about people saying, well, I sort of have a religious feeling, but for me to go to church, go to synagogue, even go to mosque, I had one or two friends or acquaintances from the business world tell me that I have to park my reason at the door. And I felt that with the onslaught of these evangelical atheist books, like the two I mentioned, and many, many more, from Daniel Dennett, from from Sam Harris, Letter to a Christian Nation. I can keep going on and on. But Richard Dawkins' book sold something like 6 million copies. Christopher Hitchens, probably a number, maybe even in excess of that. So there was this big trend toward listening to these, and then I looked for a book that would respond to them, or that was in the other direction. And I found a few, but they were either so heavily Christian that you first had to be Christian before you could read it. It really wasn't it didn't start from scratch. Where there are a couple of Jewish books, Permission to Believe, Permission to Receive, but they're not that. I mean, you also have sort of had to be a believer first. And the other thing that I wanted to do was to write a book that would allow believers and non-believers to sit down and talk to each other. Because the other thing I found in my journey is that it's sort of become, unfortunately, like a lot of our conversations in society today, where people are talking past each other. And I wanted to figure out how we could have a common space. And that's what this book is about. It's about finding a common space, recognizing that there is no proof of God and there's no proof that God doesn't exist. So what is religion about? What is atheism about? What are the central tenets of atheism? What did the Bible come to do? And that's what I think those are questions that are more relevant today, and for better, for worse, than ever.
So Scott, I noticed throughout the book, you quote Christian theologians, or I should say non-Jewish theologians. I think there were some imams that were quoted as well. What prompted you? So was that an attempt for a Jew to write a book for everyone?
Yeah. So look, one of the great things about the journey of the book was sitting down with Cardinal Dolan and sitting down with Reverend Dr. Calvin Butts and Imam Shamsi Ali and Reverend Dr. Chloe Breyer, just a whole bunch of really wonderful people. But although I'm appearing at a Jewish book council event, I would say 80% of my appearances are in Christian venues or in Christian media, easily 80%. And so I wanted to write a book, unlike Getting Our Groove Back, where 99.5% of the people that read it were Jews and the other 0.5% were close personal friends who said they read it, but probably got turned off after the first 2 or 3 chapters. This book I really wrote for everybody, and I felt like I'm coming at this from a Jewish perspective, so I wanted to get non-Jewish voices in, but I didn't realize how great that would be. I mean, the transcripts, I recorded all my conversations with these folks, from just about evangelical to Greek Orthodox. I sat down with the Greek Orthodox plenipotentiate, just one step below an archbishop in the Greek Orthodox hierarchy. By the way, I appeared at the largest Greek Orthodox church in the New York area, which was a great event. There was only, by the way, I just have to say this, there was only one thing that surprised me. They had me come after church services on Sunday, and they have a collation, and it's like our Kiddush. And I actually went there with my daughter, who sort of took the books and sold the books and did all that. And I was blown away because we didn't know what to do, because everybody got in line for the food. And everybody, there was like formal, nice lines. Nobody rushed the Kiddush table. We didn't know what to do with ourselves.
Right. No one was trying to get the locks, I guess, before somebody else. So one of the things I thought that was kind of interesting, and maybe you wrote it in a sort of a lighthearted way, sort of at the beginning of the book, was in the conversations, the 3 different types of perspectives that people have. And I was wondering if you want to share that with us.
Sure. Well, I've really learned that, and this came from those conversations I was referring to, which is that there's one group that just thinks that religion is stupid. I mean, Samuel Harris at one point says that if you're a believer, you should be put in a cage because you're dangerous to other people. That belief is wholly dangerous, that you are sort of a menace to society if you believe. But even people who aren't quite that extreme think that it's just that religion and belief in God is like Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny. Makes no sense. Science has disproven God. Let's move on to something else, and we're on our own. And that's actually, you touched upon the person I had lunch with at Solo, Zichrona Livracha, which was a kosher restaurant no longer here. And he said, he came because that's where I invited him on a business meeting. And that's what touched off the conversation, what we were doing at a kosher restaurant. And he basically said, more or less, maybe not in quite exactly those words, but more or less what I start the book with, which is, why are we trying to understand God when the highest form of being in the universe is man? I mean, it was quite clear, the deification of man and honoring and respecting and raising man, and that leads to idolatry. And we can get to that later. And I hope we really do dive into idolatry, because that's one of the central themes of the book that I think the whole Bible came to address, and Judaism certainly came to address. The second group of people, and these are some of the parents that I spoke to.
But I have to interrupt you so I can quote you about the first group of people. You said, these people believe that the book Religion for Dummies should have been titled Religion is for Dummies.
Yes. So it was I tried to keep the book a little light because, it's a lot of deep subjects. So that was my attempt. That was one of my attempts. Hopefully they worked. And
it was a good attempt. It was successful.
So the second group were people to some degree like the parents I spoke to who sent their kid to Georgetown, which is, they believe. They're certainly believers, but they don't think it's rational, and they can't explain it to their children, and they can't explain why it makes sense to believe in God. And they say, okay, I believe. I feel it in they wouldn't use the word kishkis, but they feel in their kishkis. And they know they really believe, but they can't articulate why. Doesn't make sense. They're easily floored by counter arguments. And to a certain degree, I wrote this book for them. And I've actually gotten a lot of response from people like like that, both again, Jew and non-Jew, that, and I'll give one parenthetical here. If you look at the book, one of the things I tried to do, the book is really meant to be read from beginning to end, but I also purposely tried to write chapters so that if people were troubled by things, they could look it up. Like there's a chapter on the Bible and genocide, the Bible and the death penalty, monotheism and violence, bad men and bad women, blaming others, and the whole science, getting to the records, general religion and science, the Bible and the origin of the universe, or science, the Bible and evolution. So if someone's bothered by something, and in that group that says, well, I believe, but I don't know why, they can go to the table of contents. They don't have to read the whole book, and they can look up something that'll give them a straightforward answer. And where there's no answer at all, I'm pretty straightforward on that too. And then the third group are people who think it's rational to believe in God with all we know about science and the historicity of the Bible and our sense of modern morality. And that's surprising to people. Some people really are taken aback by that because they're not even used to hearing those sorts of arguments. I had I was at a temple, I can't remember, it's Rabbi Wolpe's temple in LA. They arranged a debate between myself and Michael Shermer. And I'm not really that into debates. Michael Shermer, as you may know, edits Skeptic magazine, and he's written all sorts of books about I think he's written like 10, 12 books about atheism. And I have to say, he was actually taken aback because he wasn't used to people trying to argue with him on a rational basis. He was used to people arguing with him based upon belief. And one time I made him frown, and I was really happy.
Great. So Scott, throughout the book, there are references to your father, who was a Holocaust survivor. And I've always found that, first of all, as a rabbi, to me, anyone who is a survivor of the Holocaust, who still believes in God, I am always amazed by. Because I think if there was ever an opportunity or a reason for someone not to believe in God, it is having experienced firsthand the Holocaust. And whenever I've encountered a Holocaust survivor who has told me that they no longer believe in God, I felt that I had no business challenging that, not having lived through something as horrific as that. And one of the most vivid scenes in your book was one where your father is at a social club playing a card game, and they're talking about going to synagogue. And I'll let you tell the story and the way they all respond to the question that is posed.
Yeah. So my father belonged to this group in Chicago called the Jewish Lithuanian Club, and it was all survivors. And they used to meet and they'd rent places like multi-purpose rooms from synagogues that one of them was a member of, and they'd have card games and they'd do other things. They had parties too. But there was one time, and the children would come, and there would be something for us to do. Maybe probably mostly playing board games and the like. But and we knew not to ask questions about what our parents had experienced. We just knew that wasn't something that was done in those days. It's different now. This is, now I'm taking you back to the late 60s, early 70s. One day it was one of these events took place before Rosh Hashanah. And in a conversation, my Yiddish isn't very good these days. But in those days, I could recognize things somewhat. We could all the children, none of us could speak Yiddish, by the way, but we all knew more than a few words, if that makes sense. We could make out what our parents were trying to hide from us. And the card dealer said, Rosh Hashanah is coming up. Why are we bothering to go? when we were at Auschwitz, when we were in the camps, God wasn't there for us. There is no God. Maybe we should just move on. And it was so out of character for this group, because this group actually never really discussed what had happened with the camps. If you were to listen to these folks speak, it's like they lived in pre-World War II, Lithuania. Then suddenly they emerged again in the DP camps. And they would tell you plenty of stories about the DP camps, but none about the concentration camps. And so and it still so sticks in my head. I can almost place everyone around the table. It was such a searing thing, and it was not just for me, but for the other children there. So one person says, "You're right. God wasn't there. Let's get over it. We're on our own." Another person says, "God was there, but people weren't. This was all avoidable, but nobody stood up." Another person says, "There's a bigger picture. There wouldn't have been an Israel without the Holocaust." And as it's going around the table, people are giving their perspectives, and they're really, you could hear literally a pin drop at this. And finally, they stop and they do what they do in life. They start playing cards again and they move on, because they're not going to let this great theological conundrum stop them from living. And I learned something very, very deep that I didn't get until after that conversation from my father. My father we belonged to Congregation Beth Shalom in Chicago in East Rogers Park. And when my father would go to service, my father was taken to concentration camps before his 14th birthday. But by that time, he knew Hebrew, he knew Chumash some, he knew, it was Cheder, it was the old days. And he went to synagogue and he could do the prayers, but he didn't pray. He'd, do some of the general stuff. And on his yort side, he'd lead the prayers, because that's what he was expected to do. So I knew he was pretty fluent. He could do, he would do all of Shacharit. He'd schlep me with him for yort sites and the like. But when we were in synagogue together, he didn't pray. He talked to the person next to him, talked to the person behind him. When the rabbi spoke, sorry, Rabbi Appel, but he dozed off. And then when Musaf would come, he'd go to the back, they'd have some schnapps. He did everything, and his other survivor friends did everything but pray. And it took me a while to figure it out. And I write this in the book, is that my father didn't have any doubts about God. He was certain there was a God, because if he were one step ahead, one step behind, one step sideways, either way, many, many times he would have been dead. He would have been murdered. He would have starved. He would have been killed. He would have been sent on a work camp duty where no one came back. So many times he came this close to death. If those I see 3 or 4 paintings on the wall behind you, if they were in a different order, he would have been dead. He knew it was so small of the chance of him getting to Chicago and having a son that he had no doubt there was a God. He was certain there was God. There were too many miracles, too many things that just couldn't have all happened. By the same token, he was angry at God, because he had survived, and it wasn't guilt. It was anger at God. He had survived, but his father was murdered, more or less in front of him. His brothers were murdered. His aunts, he didn't have any sisters, his aunts, his uncles, just about all of his cousins. My closest cousin is a second cousin once removed, her mother had happened to leave to go to Palestine at the time for some sort of kibbutz, and was actually planning on coming back, but obviously never did during the war. Otherwise, I don't know, my closest cousin probably be a fifth cousin once removed for all I know. So he was absolutely certain there was a God that had saved him. And at the same time, absolutely angry that God hadn't saved the rest of his family.
It's interesting that he was able to sort of hold both of those emotions simultaneously, to believe in God but be angry at God at the same time. I guess, so how did all of that kind of inform your own Jewish journey?
No question it did. The question of good and evil, and how can an all good God allow evil in the world, became a central question for me in my life. That's what the whole third section of the book is about, is that if we believe in an all good God, how does the world exist in this way that it does? And I spend a lot of time in that section talking about trying to fuse what we know from the social sciences, and also a little bit of philosophy, but with something that I call the anthropic principle, which is the theistic principle, not the anthropic, the theistic principle, which is that if there were a God, what would this, and God wanted us to make choices and of good and evil, what would this world look like? And a lot of bad stuff that happens in the world, sadly, is from human choice. I mean, prior to the Holocaust, Germany was trying to get rid of the Jews, as we all know. They would have, in 35, 36, Jews could have gone anywhere they wanted to. They might have lost their assets, and they wouldn't even have lost all of those, but they could go anywhere. The problem was they couldn't get in. There's the Bermuda Conference, where famously a Canadian official is said that no Jews are too many for Canada. None is too many. Remember that? You can Google it. It's a famous quote. None is too many. We now know that Franklin Roosevelt knew what was going on completely and was blaming anti-Semitism, even though my parents loved Roosevelt, like all Jewish Democrats from Chicago. He knew exactly what was going on, and there are interviews and records now that show that he thought that he sort of blamed the Jews for being difficult with their neighbors and the like. And a non-Jewish Secretary of Labor had a plan to bring all the Jews from Europe to the United States, and Roosevelt quashed it, and I could go on and on. Throughout the world, decisions were made that allowed the Jews to be murdered. Those were human decisions. They could have gone the other way. And what I try to talk about is in the sort of, we just passed the holiday of Purim. And I think one of the lessons of the holiday of Purim is that when we do the right thing, we get a tailwind, and things go a little easier. I think if we'd done the right thing as humanity, I think it would have worked out a lot better, obviously. But we didn't do the right thing. Many humans didn't do the right thing. We didn't do what Esther did, which is risk her life. And the American Jewish community, else in sadness, didn't do that. So you get things not generally like the Holocaust, but you get bad actions. And that's most of the evil in the world, is from people. It's from people doing evil. And that's what the Holocaust was about, sadly. And there's no good answer for why God allows it. There's no good answer. For me, one of the things I learned in this journey is that the hardest question for believers is why God allows evil to happen. That's a very difficult question for believers. All the other questions are actually harder for atheists.
Thank you, Scott. So one of the themes of your book is idolatry. And I know you want to talk about that a little bit. And we actually had a great question that was emailed in advance of tonight from one of our temple members. Is the Republicans' attitude toward the former president idol worship? And without wanting to get too political, many of us may have seen the golden statue of Trump at CPAC, at the Conservative Political Action Committee conference just last week, being wheeled around and everyone wanting to take their picture with it. And certainly as we're reading the book of Exodus right now and thinking it couldn't help but remind us of the golden calf.
Yeah, this week is Kitisa.
Right. Yes.
This
Right.
is it. Couldn't have been better
Right.
timing.
Right. Timing is everything. So I was wondering, what do you make of it? First of all, I guess, why is idolatry such an interesting topic to you in terms of your book about God? And how do you see it playing out right now in our contemporary moment?
So I will get to the question at the end because I want to build up to that in terms of first laying the groundwork for what idolatry is. So idolatry really is the central point of, or fighting idolatry, I think, is the central point of all Judaism. And I begin the book, that's the first section, is why the Bible? Why did the Bible come to be? Why was it necessary? And Richard Dawkins has a great quote. I'm going to paraphrase it, but he says, monotheism's great. It's directionally correct. There were many, many gods on the Olympus, and many, many gods in the Far East and the Near East and the Far West, and in barbarian Europe, and there were hundreds of gods. And then monotheists took it to one, and it's directionally correct towards zero. That's the right number. That's what he says. So, but what is the difference between many gods and one God? And that's a critical question. And I think it's the reason for the Bible, which is the Bible makes clear what idolatry is all about. And if everyone remembers one thing from tonight's conversation, I hope you remember this. The Bible defines idolatry as a set of lies about power. It's about a set of lies that ascribe super authority or superpower to finite beings like us people, natural processes, ideologies, or in the ancient world, animals. Not so much today, although a little bit still, unfortunately. So from the god King Pharaoh, who we thought we defeated in Exodus, and we were done with idolatry, we actually arrived at the 20th century, which is a catalog of god King Pharaohs: Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, the Assad family, the Kim family, Hitler, of course. And it goes on and on. They all use the same tropes as the god King Pharaoh. Stalin killed all the kulaks, 3 million people, starved a quarter of the Ukraine, sent tens of millions to the gulag. He famously had his own likeness put into space by the Soviet Space Agency. How did he get away with all this? With killing tens of millions? Because people believed he had super authority of some sort. People didn't question what Stalin did. They did what he said. Mao caused the death of probably 75 million of his comrades. And you know what? People believed that was okay. And Mao said he would find it acceptable 300 million of his Chinese comrades died as long as it ensured the ascendancy of the Chinese Communist Party. So when you think about that, the ideology, that Mao was just the God King, the ideology, the idolatry was to the Chinese Communist Party or to the Soviet Communist Party, whatever. And there was no room for individual humanity. So that's sort of the idea of idolatry on a big mega macro picture. And by the way, how is this idolatry being enforced on a macro picture? By the same tropes as Pharaoh again. Poetry, pageantry, myth, all of course backed up by strong secret police and violence against anybody who disagrees with the regimes. On a micro basis, on a level of our personal connections, the same thing happens as well. How did Charlie Rose, Matt Lauer, Harvey Weinstein, unfortunately I'm mentioning some Jewish names here, and Eric Schneiderman, for those of you in New York, how did they get away with what they got away with? Because they too exhibited, again, not superpower, but super authority. If Harvey Weinstein said you were done with your career in being an actress, you were. And by the way, abused some men too. But if he said something, he had super authority. You were done. You weren't getting casted. You were blacklisted. And if he wanted you in a movie or the like, you got it. So he had super authority. He set himself up essentially as an idol, unquestioned and unquestionable. And idols determine and set what is their truth. And they can make up anything. And that's very, very dangerous. It's very dangerous when, and it's unfortunately the way, it's just like what the God King Pharaoh did, what Stalin did, what Mao did. They come up with their own version of reality. And if you're not on that version, then you're out. So, I mean, from that answer, you can infer my answer on anybody who says things that are just falsely, patently untrue, which is, that's a sign of emerging idolatry. And I want to say this, there's also idolatry on the far left. There's no question about it, that there's idolatry on the far left too, where certain folks have, when they speak, that's it. It's done. If Angela Davis says something, it's accepted by the far left, whether it's right or wrong. And it's dangerous. It's truly, truly dangerous. And I think that that's why I'm so worried about these times. We're living in a time where people can just say, well, January 6th, we're going to overturn the election. Because, I'm convinced that the votes weren't counted right. We're in deep trouble. We're in deep trouble when that happens.
Great.
I don't know how much of that answer you got, Rabbi.
That's good. That's good. Thank you. Now, I wanted to, hold on one second. Having a little feedback.
You got two
here.
going.
Yeah, a little feedback. Okay. Wanted to talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what is the pandemic a cause for atheism? I mean, how do we talk about how do we wrap our heads around the pandemic?
Well, look, the pandemic is in a way similar to what I was talking about before, which is part of it. The whole Bible is about God giving us tests. And some of those tests even were machalot, they were plagues. I mean, this isn't the first time we've witnessed plagues in the history of the world. It's how do we deal with the cards that we are dealt? Do we pass the test or don't pass the test? Do we pass this? The Jewish people this week with the golden calf didn't pass the test. And so it didn't work out so well. But I think that this current pandemic, this current plague, is also another test for us. Are we going to do the right thing? Are we not going to do the right thing? Are we going to do the right thing as individuals? And are we going to do the right thing as society? And that's really where the rubber meets the road in many ways. So it's not a cause for atheism. The really, as I said before, there's no proof that there's no God. And anybody who says that is really making it up, just as there's no proof that there is a God. This pandemic, as I've said, is consistent with believing in God and us facing tests. Abraham faced 10 tests, according to most Jewish commentators. The Jews faced a lot of tests. Jacob faced a lot of tests. Sometimes they failed those tests. Jacob, famously used deception. He had very bad repercussions for him. So if we fail moral tests, we do have troubles. And that's what the whole Bible is about. But when we actually do the right thing, again, we get a wind to our back. And that's part of what religion is or belief in God is believing that God wants us to make the right decisions, but isn't going to make those decisions for us. That's, as Isaac Bashevis Singer famously said about the Jews, we believe in free will, we have no choice.
So as a rabbi, there are two things that people like to say to me when they find out that I'm a rabbi. One is telling me how much they did not like Hebrew school, for which I have to, be responsible somehow. And the other is they love to tell me that they don't believe in God. Especially Jews love to tell me that they don't believe in God. And I've encountered more than a few liberal Jews who almost wear their atheism or their agnosticism as a badge of honor, as if they were too sophisticated for all that hocus pocus, or it's a bunch of hooey, however they might describe it. And so can one be an atheist and a Jew, in your opinion?
Well, so one of the Jewish communal roles I had is I was chair of the New York Jewish Community Study of New York, where we counted Jews in a survey way. And we decided, one of the nice things about being chair is I got to have a lot of input into the questions. And one of the questions we asked two different ways was whether people believed in God. Because asking a question one way, you don't. Answers are very sensitive actually to the questions, and I learned that even more deeply being chair of this study. So it turns out that if you go to the general population and you ask, "Do you believe in God?" with certainty, you think there's a God, or you don't believe in that there's a God. It turns out that 45-ish% of the people in the country think there's God with strong faith. Then you got another 30% to 35% who think there's a God. And then the last 20-ish% have different views of not believing, not sure, new agey, all sorts of stuff. If you go to the Jews, only about, I can't remember the number offhand, I have to go look it up, but it was something like a little less than 30% are certain there's God, really with strong faith, which is remarkably low. And then you've got another like 35%, 40% who think there's a God. If you total up the numbers, there's not a huge difference, but the composition is. But you have like 30% of Jews who don't believe in God. They're again across that spectrum. Now, we counted them as Jews because they said they were Jewish. So it wasn't a Jewish test. So I think I don't have a problem with someone saying that they're Jewish if they don't believe in God, because they were born that way. You're not going to convert to Judaism if you don't believe in God. So, but they're born that way. They like lox and bagels, like Seinfeld. They do eat Chinese food on Christmas Eve. They do all of the secular Jewish 10 commandments. They belong to the Democratic Party. They protest the right things, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all okay. I say that with just as a tiny bit of a glint of joviality, but that's fine. But that's not enough in the end. I think that lasts a generation, maybe two, but it doesn't bring us from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to 2021. It's not sustainable. And what I learned in my first book is that that's a two generation phenomena. I mean, even even the Mendelssohn family, the first sort of enlightened Jew, his grandson was already Christian. Great composer, but Christian.
Yes, indeed. So I'm going to, let's see if I have it. Hold on. I'm just putting in the chat box once again, Scott's website, in case you want to learn more about Scott and purchase his book. And by the way, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I'm sure Scott would be happy to respond to them. Scott, you ended the book with a chapter on prayer.
Yep.
And just in some ways, just as the belief in God is a challenge for some Jews, prayer is a challenge for some Jews. Back to the studies of contemporary religious experience, as a result, we know from those studies that Jews have a very low rate of synagogue attendance. And there are no shortage of Jews who will describe themselves or define themselves as cultural Jews. I like to call some of them gastronomic Jews, another branch of Judaism, along with Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, gastronomic. And so we're not, interestingly enough, we're not a praying people, it seems sometimes. And I was wondering, what's your response to that? I mean, a lot of Jews have trouble with prayer, and they don't quite get it, or they walk away from worship uninspired.
Yep.
And certainly as rabbis, as clergy, we rack our brains about that. We would like to figure out how to get more people inspired and interested in prayer.
Well, as I was saying before, I grew up with a father who went to synagogue but didn't pray. It was totally a social experience for him, and he was giving God the silent treatment. But from him, the funny part was, or I don't want to call it funny, but the poignant part was, he was saying to God, "I'm here. Where were you?" That's why he's showing up at synagogue but not praying to him, because he wasn't gonna give him that sort of deference. So I will tell you that writing this book, the most profound personal change I've had is in prayer, by far. The thing I've changed most about me is prayer. Because we can't actually, I don't think, believe that there's an omnipotent, omnipotent, and omniscient God, and that we're going to say to God, "Well, you did a great job, except for one thing. I really should have won the lottery or gotten this Camaro, or the muscle car I've always wanted." You know, that's the one thing in the universe that you didn't quite get right, God. Or being more serious, you know, with personal or health or other issues. And the question, I think, and I've really tried to study the Bible on prayer when it's successful and unsuccessful, because there are lots and lots of examples of both. So later on, we're going to read. We're reading the Bible, and it's coming up after in all in Devarim in Numbers, about Moses' most successful prayer. He says, it's really hard for me to do this all by myself. The people are complaining they don't have meat. The people, I've got too much on my own going on. I need help. And God immediately gives him 70 prophets, and a whole bunch of quail fly in. So much quail that people are eating meat until they can't eat it anymore. His prayers answered like that perfectly. And what happens? Nothing. It doesn't help anything. So Moses has a better plan, and it doesn't work. On the other hand, later, after the spies come back and people are the Israelites are despairing of going into the promised land and say, we should have died in Egypt. Why did God bring us here, etc., etc. Moses prays again. And here, the answer isn't so good. The answer is, this people's going to have to drop dead. And Moses, you're never going to make it into we already know, sort of as a foreshadowing, Moses isn't, this generation is done. It's not an easy answer. But on the other hand, the answer is, if this generation were to march into the promised land, that would be the end of the story, because these folks aren't capable of starting a nation. They're not capable of anything. So he gives them an answer he doesn't like. And Moses accepts it. And in reality, that's the best answer. So sometimes our prayers are not answered necessarily in the way we want them answered. But what I think is that if you can figure out what God wants, like Hannah did in the beginning of the book of Samuel, and you can place yourself in what is needed. What did Hannah need? Hannah, everybody in the beginning of the book of Samuel is off base. They're misperceiving what the problem is. They're the shrine at Shiloh is corrupt. It's a problematic, I don't want to go through it all, but it's a problematic situation. And she realizes what's needed is a prophet. She's barren. And she says, look, God, if you give me a child, I'll raise that child to be the prophet you need. She situates her in the place of what she can do and what needs to be done. And what I think in prayer is that we are searching for that place of what we can do and what needs to be done. And it's not always so easy to move us there. But if we can move ourselves there, then again, I think we get a tailwind. And that, this journey, this writing of the book, this listening to a whole bunch of people in all sorts of different faiths, really changed the way I pray dramatically. And, I think we don't believe as Jews, on Sunday morning, you can get up and listen to Joel Osteen. I don't know how many people have done that. He's a great preacher, but we don't believe things are just coming to us. We believe we need to put ourselves in that right place and situate ourselves in that right place. And then we have to, then we're trusting in God that we'll get that tailwind. But it requires, we have to pray, and I'll end with this. We need to pray as though everything depends on God, but act as though everything depends on us.
Yes. A well-quoted line that is in our Siddur, Mishkan Tefillah. I often come back to one of my favorite quotes from a book that I love very much. If you want a swing set, pray for a neighborhood playground,
Mhm.
which I think is a very evolved idea of prayer. So Scott, tell us, is there another book? Should we be looking for another book from you?
Well, I didn't think so, but the answer is yes. I have another book that is actually at the publisher right now in editing. I'm not quite ready to announce it, but it is hopefully, we don't have a pub date yet, and as soon as we have a publication date, I'll be happy to announce it. The funny thing is, one book seems to go to another in terms of my own life journey. And I'm not actually ever expecting to write the book that I write next. And this is another one of those cases. So I'm hoping that I'll be back with the Jewish Book Council.
Great.
Hopefully, we'll see. I assume they were kind enough. They've been very good, the Jewish Book Council. I want to give them a shout out.
Yes.
I want to give them a definite shout out. I can say one or two more quick things that are
Sure.
shameless plugs.
Please.
I'll say an al-Kheit later in the year for all the shameless plugs that I put in. You were kind enough to put the website up. There is material on the website. I comment on all sorts of things. There's also discussion groups on the book that have taken place both in Jewish and non-Jewish venues. People can sign up. People can, get more information. And I write as well about things like the economy and various ethical issues with respect to banking and the like. Those are also available there. And I urge everybody to get the book. And it's also out in paperback, out in Audible. People love the Audible. I've gotten great. The fellow reads it has a much better voice than me. And I thank you. I want to thank you, Rabbi. I want to thank David Galish for that, again, that warm and generous introduction. And to all your congregants who are with us virtually.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for a really great presentation, a great evening. It's a great book. I encourage you to read it. I think it covers an awful lot, and is written in a very forthright and very honest way, which is I think we all appreciate. So with that, thank you so much, Scott. Our thanks to the Jewish Book Council, and thank you all for spending this hour with us tonight. We had a great time.